No, I did my PhD in the United States.
Oh, okay. And then so now you're just doing your postdoc.
Yeah.
Hi, Andrew. Are you able to hear me?
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Sorry, I'm okay.
No
I was
worries.
like, a little out of it for a bit there because I was out and then I look after my mom.
Oh, yeah.
I was like, it's like 1:30. I'm fine. And I was like, holy shit, it's 2021. I should probably go downstairs. So I'm in the basement room. It's the best I can do in the house. So as long as you can hear me okay.
Yeah, we can hear you. So I'm just at the Harriet Tubman Institute now.
Hi. Yeah.
Resource room. There are some folks who are here who wanted to, it's a virtual event, but they wanted to join in like a viewing party.
Yeah, sure. That's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm gonna eventually move and sit back there.
Okay. So I'm just need to remember how to do something. And because the way my brain is, I have trouble.
I'm gonna make you a co-host. So you'll have permissions to share your screen and all that.
Yeah.
Uh,
How do I go? Hannah?
So hold on. So she's giving you permission,
Oh, okay.
and then you can do.
Sorry. You need to get out of here. In garbage. I have a dog.
oh,
And when I'm talking, she thinks, oh, he's talking to me. Okay, so now what am I doing? This is Hannah,
hi, Hannah.
partner Hannah, who will, okay, so how do I make this full screen?
So,
And then I need to share it.
so what you do first is you go here.
Yeah.
To this button here.
Hi, Max. That's Max, my oldest child.
You just pick
Hey.
screen,
Hi, Max.
and then you click there.
Yeah.
You click share. And then you can make that full screen.
With the green?
Yeah.
Wow.
Great.
Look at that. I actually,
There it is.
and then what do I do with this?
So this is, no one is seeing this.
Oh.
They're just seeing this. But then
Okay.
at the side here, you can see people.
Oh, I see people.
And I would
How's
just,
it
Oh,
going?
I got it. I'm good.
Are you able to click? Oh, there we go. Perfect. Yeah, this is great. You guys able to see?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect.
Great.
I'm just gonna go get myself some stop.
Okay, so Andrew,
Yep.
once Salewa comes,
Yeah.
we will. Well, we'll start. We
That's
might
good.
wait for some more folks to
Yeah.
come in. We'll do a land acknowledgement first. Salewa will do that and introduce you as today's speaker.
Yeah.
And then you're free to go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, sorry, my charger's not working.
Oh.
It's okay. It will. It comes and goes. It's finicky.
That's all right.
So what I'm going to do, I'm going to do a bit of an intro myself and some acknowledging of some folks. And then I'm going to do a couple of readings. But I'll say to folks in it, it's like I have a plan, but I am very flexible. And I really appreciate doing this. And the ability to have conversation and dialogue. So if there feels like, I don't know if people are allowed to make comments and, it feels like something has surfaced that would be valuable for us to have a conversation about, I can modify what I'm doing. I'm not on a strict,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
This to me is an opportunity for all of us to share, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe you could mention that in the beginning, that if folks have like a comment that they want to share, that they can kind of jump in, or even
Okay.
do it in the chat box, and then you're free to kind of moderate that as you wish. Typically we do like a Q&A at the end.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's up to you. You
Yeah.
can save
Yeah.
that.
And it might be like, it's fine. if like people will can wait to that point. But yeah, sometimes people they want clarity, or somebody has something really significant to share and they don't want to forget it, or they might have to go. So I just want, like this, as I said, it's important to me that this isn't just about me talking to people, right? It's about, I really benefit from the feedback, which is why I love doing these in person, but also that I understand the format better, the way my brain is. And so I know this can be a really rich exchange. Okay.
Great.
Except with my oldest, Max, who's here, they have to listen to me all the time. So.
No worries. All right.
Hello, Salewa. Did I say that correctly?
Yes. Hello, Andrew.
Hi, how are you? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for agreeing to give us this talk today.
Oh yeah, it means a great deal.
Yeah.
My dog is attacking a garbage pail. Can't find my notes in this book. There it is. Yeah. How are things at York?
Good. Good. Thank you. Good. Thank you.
Good. Yeah. She's gonna start crying. She might be able to come to her. I have a very needy dog who may have to be in the room, but she won't be making noise, he says with some confidence.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna just whenever be focusing my brain. Okay.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna
mute first.
Okay. All right. So I'm not sure if we went over this already. I'm going to just start with the York land acknowledgement, then I introduce you, and then you give your talk, and then I give room for questions afterwards. Hello, Andrew.
Hi, that's perfect.
Okay.
And
All
as
right.
I was saying to Rebecca, this isn't like a very like super formal talk. I mean, I will be reading, I have a plan, but if there's a sense of a discussion point or question or clarity, or somebody has to check out but really has something to point to say, I'm open to being interrupted to have that. Okay, so I see the not as me lecturing, but as an opportunity for a community of us that came together to talk, right?
Okay.
And I value constructive criticism, right? Like I'm happy to have people, you know I don't have to give anybody permission to call out things, but that's what this is for. That's what it's about. That's what the book's about. Right?
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
So we're going to start. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming to our first Tubman talk of the year. So I'm going to start off with the land acknowledgement. York University recognizes that many Indigenous nations have long-lasting relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tikaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes regions. So thank you, everyone. Welcome virtually to York University. So today we have a book launch. We have a talk by Andrew Hunter. Andrew is a freelance writer, a curator, an artist, and an educator. Hunter was previously the Frederik S. Eaton Curator of Canadian Art at the Art Gallery of Ontario. where he produced major exhibitions and publications, including Every Now Then, Reframing Nationhood with Anique Jordan, In the Word, Lawren Harris, Toronto, and the Idea of North and Colville. So Andrew is going to be talking to us about his new book, It Was There All the Time, Sophia Burton and the Legacy of Slavery in Canada. So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here, and over to you, Andrew.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Salewa. It's a real privilege and an honor to get to speak with the community in connection to the Tubman Institute. And congratulations on the creation of the Tubman Institute. Remarkable. What I'm going to do is I'm going to thank some folks. I'm going to be reading from my book, but also a couple of other writers. I was mentioning to Salewa and Rebecca that I'm not an academic scholar. This isn't a lecture. It's an opportunity for me to share a story and a journey. And I really welcome lots of feedback, lots of critical thoughts and comments. I see this as a gathering of the group of us who came together today, certainly instigated by my opportunity to share my work, but should be a platform for other people as well. And I benefit hugely from these experiences. I meet people, I learn things, and it carries me further on the journey. So I really thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be here. I'm sitting in a room in the basement of my mom's house, who I live and care for my mom with my partner, Hannah, and my dog Zag, who is here, who will hopefully not make too much noise. So the dog, not Hannah. Hannah can make as much noise as she likes. I want to begin with some thank yous. This book and my process, the book reflects my process for years, comes out of building community and conversation and dialogue and critical back and forth, people supporting in each other's work. And there's lots of people, and inevitably you go like, I'm going to thank some people, and then you forget 5. I'm sorry. Hopefully it gets covered in other ways, but so this will be fair, quick. But I first and foremost want to thank Goose Lane Editions, the Canada's oldest independent publisher, for engaging with this book and getting on board and taking the time to do it, and also the time to find the right people to work with me on it. And in particular, that included my editor, Fazila Jiwa, amazing editor who had previously worked on Robin Maynard's book, Policing Black Lives, and Alicia Perez. Great people, thank you so much. Reagan Greenidge, who I'm going to talk about at the end of this, the book is dedicated to. Chantal Gibson, poet, artist. I have a pile of books here just to wave at people. So if you can get, so Chantal Gibson, amazing poet, teaches at Simon Fraser. This is one of her recent books, award-winning books, How She Read. Chantal read one of the first drafts of the book, which was like way too long, 200,000 words. It was crazy. Read it, feedback, asked tough questions, demanded certain things in a good way. I don't mean she was demanding. Thank you, Chantal. Dr. Camille Turner, Afrofuturist, I've known for a long time. I've learned so much from them and the work they do, and particularly about how do we work into the archive? How do we discover, find traces of people that were not recorded as people? How do we find persons who were recorded as chattel? And so a brilliant artist, thank you, Camille. Dr. Chrmaine Nelson, who I've known for a while when they were at McGill, and is now with Slavery Northinitiative at Amherst, University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Chrmaine, again, somebody that hugely supportive when I began the journey to write this book. Shelley Nero, again, someone who read the book and real supporter. Raven Spiratos, who I met through Chrmaine, who was one of the readers of the book. Anique Jordan, whose work is behind me. Brilliant artist, curator, scholar, human being. I had the privilege of working with them on several things, and it was really an honor to have her work be present in the book. David and Teresa at King West Books in Hamilton, where I had the opportunity to write. The poet C.S. Giscombe at Berkeley, who I'd never met, but I fangirled. I wrote a letter and they responded, and that was amazing. Dr. Marinka Thompson-Odlum, who I met in Glasgow, who's now at Oxford. Lawrence Hill, Jeff Thomas, who's an elder, close colleague. Adrian Shadd, the great writer of Black History in Ontario, who I've known for a while. People at the Dutchess County Historical Society, where Sophia Berthen was born in Dutchess County. Guelph Black Heritage Society, the Afro-Canadian Caribbean Association of Hamilton and Taliba Howard, and Credible Mohawk at Tyndega, and Drew Brandt in particular. Amazing, amazing support. They were the first kind of media to pick up on the book, and I appreciate the work they're doing greatly. And then also, and I probably missed a few folks, but the writers who I reached out to, who I did not know, but gave permission to have their work incorporated into the book. That was really generous. And one in particular, Tracy Smith, who was Poet Laureate of the United States, very generous. I'm going to flash a few books and then I'm going to start reading. Lots of different writers I've known over the years and scholars who have had a huge influence on my work through conversation. Some people I've met personally, some it's been at a distance. Michael Groth, who wrote Slavery and Freedom in the Mid-Hudson Valley, really important to understanding the history of slavery in New York, and particularly the world that Sophia Berthen comes out of. Lose Your Mother, Saidiya Hartman, is heartbreaking, brilliant, not just for the story it tells, but how the story is told. And I think of myself, I am a writer. So when I took on doing this project, I want to tell a story. I want more people to understand Sophia's journey, who she was, and that world, but I also want to write a good book. And so inspired by people like Saidiya Hartman and also Christina Sharp in the wake. Again, I'm just choosing a selection, a few things. Eddie Glaude and his book Begin Again on the work of James Baldwin, and I'm going to talk about Baldwin quite a bit. And I mentioned before Chrmaine Nelson. This is a brilliant book published by Routledge, Slavery, Geography, and Empire in 19th Century Marine Landscapes of Montreal and Jamaica. Really important. There are lots of other folks, and final one I'll just share, Ronaldo Walcott and Adil Abdillahi, post Black Lives Matter and the struggle for freedom, Black life. So hopefully just the people I'm acknowledging and the things I share give you a sense that this book crosses deep time. It goes very far back in deep time, even into geology, and right up to the present, and also imagining futures, which is why the book is called It Was Dark There All the Time, Sophia Berthen and the Legacy of Slavery in Canada. So the screen you're seeing right now, just to share, the book covers on the left, it incorporates a view of the Niagara River and the crossing point at Lewiston, New York. And on the right is a photograph of what's left of the cemetery in the Queensbush where Sophia Berthen lived in 1851 when she was interviewed by the Boston writer Benjamin Drew. And you're going to hear more about them when I start to read. But I wanted, if I can make this advance, there. I wanted to begin by reading, hopefully everybody can hear me okay, and tell you a bit about this man, Benjamin Drew. So Benjamin Drew wrote a book called The Refugee, a North Side View of Slavery, that was published in 1856. And he came from Boston, and he interviewed Sophia Berthen. That's the only record we have, and that's how we know. So I'm going to start to read from the first chapter of my book, and the chapter number 1 is called What's in a Name. But before I do that, I'm going to read you 2 quotes. The first one is from James Baldwin, who has had a huge influence on me, and I'm going to talk a bit about James Baldwin in a bit. James Baldwin says, "A journey is called that because you cannot know what you will discover on the journey, what you will do with what you find, or what you find will do to you." The second quote is from Dr. Chrmaine Nelson. "Since at least the 17th century, Africans arrived in Canada in bondage. Their forcible relocation from Africa or other parts of the Americas was facilitated by their designation, first as cargo and subsequently as chattel, a strategy that excluded them from the category of settler. That these histories, spanning over 200 years and two empires, British and French, are overwhelmingly disavowed is a result of Canada's national myth of racial tolerance and, concomitantly, the profound failures of Canada's education system. However, it does not take much digging to uncover the lie of our blinkered, heroic national self-aggrandizement as the territory to which enslaved African Americans fled." And then the third is, again, James Baldwin. "History is not the past, history is the present. We carry our history with us, and to think otherwise is criminal." So I'm going to begin. I'm going to read for a bit, and again, just make a comment if you want less reading and more conversation. Chapter 1, What's in a Name? This is a quote from Sophia Berthen. "Carried us to a vessel, put us in the hold, and sailed up the river. I know not how far nor how long. It was dark there all the time." Sophia Berthen, Pooley, 1855. She carries three names. The first, Sophia, is common. Its Christian meaning is divine wisdom. To Muslims, it means beautiful. Let us think of her in these dignified terms. Her last name, Pooley, she took from the man she married in freedom. Her Pooley refers to a pond or a pool of water, from Old English pole, from Dutch pool, that is located next to a ley, an area of pasture or grassland. Ley can also refer to a ley line, a supposed straight line connecting three or more prehistoric or ancient sites, sometimes regarded as the line of a former track and associated by some with lines of energy and other paranormal phenomena. Pooley is riparian, as in fed by or living near the banks of a river. Wise and beautiful, she sits by water at the edge of a field. I am searching for the ley lines which still pulse, linking her across time and space to this moment. It is her maiden name, her enslaved name, Berthen, that carries the most weight and casts the longest shadow. Berthen is an archaic English word that will become burden, the TH morphing into a single D. It now means a physical thing one carries or a psychological weight of anxiety, trauma, or depression that can or will be passed on to others, becoming a responsibility, quote, the burden of proof, and maybe a curse lingering in the past and shading the future. But originally, it was a very specific nautical term referring to a ship's measure or capacity, a ship's tons burthen, defined the very weight and quantity of what it could hold and convey, its maximum cargo, as it was used in the text of the following fugitive slave advertisement. Run away about 10 o'clock Thursday, last from John Cannon, New York City. 3 Negroes with a sloop belonging to said Cannon, burthen about 35 tons. Whoever takes up and returns said Negro men and the sloop shall receive 20 pounds and all reasonable charges from John Cannon, end quote. That was from 1755. The average burthen of ships plying the Middle Passage was much more than 35 tons. The 125-foot ship Diamond, for example, launched in 1798 by Patrick Beatson and Company, with construction overseen by Henry Baldwin, was the first large cargo vessel built in Quebec since the British ended French rule of the colony in 1763. Upon changing ownership in 1801 to Perry and Company of London, it was retrofitted, its hull sheathed with copper, and the cargo hold divided with a second deck. Its burthen reduced from over 500 to 443 tons. Under Captain James Clark, Diamond sailed from London to West Africa and then made 2 known deliveries of enslaved Africans to the West Indies. In 1802, 391 persons were transported to Trinidad. In 1803, 389 persons were transported to Cuba. 44 died on each of these 2 voyages. Diamond's time working the Middle Passage was brief. It was retrofitted for whaling in 1804. There was another Diamond, Danish-built, sailing from Liverpool and London under Captain William Jameson, that transported 986 enslaved persons in total from Lagos on 3 voyages, with a total deaths of 111 en route to Kingston, Jamaica twice, and Grenada. In the British Empire, an act for the abolition of the slave trade passed in 1807 ended the international trade and made it illegal for British vessels to continue shipping human cargo across the Atlantic. But this did not change Sophia Berthen's enslaved status, as the sale of enslaved people within specific colonies was not stopped. Britain also continued to trade and manufacture materials and products and otherwise profit from a global economy dependent on enslaved labor. The term burthen has echoes in a ship's berth, a place to moor a ship and unload its cargo. If it's a living cargo, then the berth signifies a landing where the next stage of the journey begins, and the space within the ship where a person sleeps. Sophia carried this term as part of her name, as did her parents, Dinah and Oliver, whose first names are mentioned in her interview, and her sister, who remains otherwise unnamed in the historical record. But where did this name come from? Who burdened them with a name pointing to a past filled with journeys in the holds of various vessels in bondage? How far distant in Sophia's ancestry is the Middle Passage that forced 12 to 15 million persons into migration across the Atlantic, of whom nearly 2 million perished and were in effect murdered? Did previous generations of her family come directly to the coast of North America, or did their journey happen in stages via the Caribbean or South America, or maybe with stopovers south of New York, around the Gulf of Mexico, Georgia, the Carolinas, Virginia, Maryland, the shores of the Chesapeake? How long were the Berthens and their ancestors trapped in the triangle trade of Europe to Africa to the Americas? Do their roots go back to the early 1600s, when the Dutch West India Company imported Africans to New Amsterdam, later renamed New York City, or to the first slave auction held there in 1655? In 1855, Sophia Berthen tells Benjamin Drew, a Bostonian who has come north, that she is in her 90s. But an 1851 census lists her as 75, putting her year of birth at around 1775. At the beginning of the American Revolution, she likely, putting her year of birth 1775 at the beginning of the American Revolution. She likely died in the 1850s or early 1860s. According to Dr. Chrmaine Nelson, quote, most former slaves did not know their birth date, end quote. A fact Sophia's neighbor, John Little, demonstrated when he tells Benjamin Drew, quote, at the time of the sale, I was about 23, but being a slave, I did not know my age, end quote. The Harriet Tubman Historical Society says that the American abolitionist and activist born into an enslaved family, quote, must have been between 88 and 98 years old when she died. She claimed in her pension application that she was born in 1825. Her death certificate said she was born in 1815. Her gravestone indicated that she was born in 1820, end quote. Nelson affirms, quote, so slaves often believed they were older than they were. And why wouldn't they? Time must have progressed at an insufferably slow pace for someone trapped without the freedom to choose an existence that might feel rewarding and joyous, the freedom to shape a life so satisfying that it makes time fly. This is Sophia's voice. My master's sons-in-law, let's leave them unnamed for a while, Sophia, came into the garden where my sister and I were playing among the currant bushes. Sophia tells Drew, tied their handkerchiefs over our mouths, carried us to a vessel, put us in the hold, and sailed up the river. I know not how far nor how long. It was dark there all the time. And then we came by land. Taken as cargo, the sisters are literally burthened now, just a trace of their ancestors carried in an obscure name, held and transported on a sloop up the Hudson River, then overland. Their passage projects lines of meaning onto the enmeshed landscapes of New York and Canada today, with branches extending out across the continent and the globe. These ley lines are faint and fading, and the traces that remain can be stubbornly cryptic. Describing some of her research tracing the Atlantic slave trade, Sadia Hartman writes, quote, the archives contained what you would expect, the manifests of slavers, ledger books of trade goods, inventories of foodstuffs, bills of sale, itemized lists of bodies alive, infirm, dead, captain's logs, planters' diaries. The account of commercial transactions was as near as I came to the enslaved. In every line item, I saw a grave. Commodities, cargo, and things don't lend themselves to representation, at least not easily. The archive dictates what can be said about the past and the kinds of stories that can be told about the persons cataloged, embalmed, and sealed away in box, files, and folios. To read the archive is to enter a mortuary. It permits one final viewing and allows for a last glimpse of persons about to disappear into the slave fold, end quote. For Sophia Berthen, the hold has been the refugee and the 1851 census. One can imagine her name, or at least a description of her existing elsewhere, and one can imagine the same for her parents and sister, who remain even more elusive. In her various owners' business papers, for example, they'd be anonymous, a number listed as chattel, like furniture, equipment, or livestock, or they'd each be described as a slave or a Negro, or with their true status hidden behind an apparently neutral term like servant. When a child, Sophia would have been described as a girl. When a woman, a wench. If she had run away, we might find her in a fugitive slave advertisement. But the truth is that it was beneficial for slave owners to obscure the presence of the enslaved. They were taxable property, so many existed without a trace and do not appear in archives. This is especially true if, like Sophia, an enslaved person was born during the chaotic beginnings of a new nation that lacked an ordered bureaucracy. Generations of white scholars and educators have used these absences to further erase and deny the existence of slavery in the Northern Free States and in Canada. They often try to dismiss slavery as something common to all human societies, as if the monumental scale and scope of the system that enslaved the Berthens has any true equal. They go further and claim that slavery outside of Southern plantations was somehow more humane and that the enslaved were better off, as if there was a, quote, nice version of being owned and treated as disposable property. Quote, enslaved girls everywhere began laboring as young as 4 or 5, end quote. Margaret Washington states in Sojourner Truth's America, which meant they, quote, had little opportunity for regular interaction with other Black women and endured a cultural isolation rarely experienced in the American South, end quote. Maureen G. Elgersman Lee argues that for enslaved women like Sophia, such isolation worsened their vulnerability. Quote, it appears very probable that some Black women enslaved during the British regime lacked significant opportunity to create social bonds with other Black women based on shared gender, race, and legal status. Such isolation would have made it impossible for many Black women to go to other Black women for respite from the degradation of physical or sexual abuse, for assistance in raising children, or for celebrating religious or holidays. It is highly possible that where Black women lacked such support systems, they may have found the slave system even more trying than for a woman who had such support, end quote. Those who perpetuate racist theories that dismiss the horrors of chattel slavery are merely justifying the extreme expansion of a so-called common human evil that is the foundation of their society. Dawn settlement resident William Henry Bradley, also interviewed by Drew, bluntly dismisses the basis for such justifications. Quote, if a man could make slaves of mud or block and have them work for him, it would be wrong. All men came to life at the hand of the Almighty. Every man ought to have life and his own method of pursuing happiness, end quote. Sophia was birthed into the continuing tragedy of colonial North America in the heart of the traditional Algonquin territories of the Wapender and the Mohican people. She traversed the foundations of the interconnected nation states of modern Canada and the United States that emerged from and remained tethered to empires of slavery and the systemic assault on Indigenous peoples and their lands. Enslaved children knew their status. They worked from as young as 4 years old, were hired out and traded. They were punished and constantly exposed to loss, trauma, violence, as were their parents. In Dutchess County, New York, where Sophia was born, quote, the threat of sale was a source of constant anxiety. Actual separation produced gut-wrenching anguish, end quote. Sojourner Truth, born Isabel Bell Baumfree in 1797 in nearby Swaterkill, Ulster County, recalled that her mother, who she referred to as Mama Bet, quote, saw most of her children sold away. Sojourner herself never knew several of her older siblings, but she knew her status. She was sold 3 times in 1 year. Sophia would have known hers too. Near the end of her life, Sophia's stories came into Drew's possession under his claim that he will endeavor to collect with the view to placing there, his interviewees, quote, testimony on record, their experiences of actual workings of slavery and such statements bearing upon the weighty subjects of oppression and freedom, end quote. Weighty subjects, yet he misses the true weight of Sophia's unique narrative, as she had not, as he declares, quote, fled from the North and the South into Upper Canada to escape the oppression exercised upon them by their native countrymen, end quote. She did not come to Canada a fugitive or free, but as chattel. She does not fit Drew's narrative, which will nearly erase Sophia as her history becomes buried beneath well-burnished myths of the Underground Railroad and its promises of freedom in Canada and a present-day Canada that it believes it is free of the legacies of slavery and systemic racism. What a surprise Sophia, a woman brought enslaved to Canada and sold here, must have been to Drew, a man born during the War of 1812 who lived to see the 20th century dawn. But perhaps she wasn't a surprise to him at all. That this woman was enslaved in Canada, however, would prove to be a revelation for future generations, for us now. Did Drew explain his project to her? Did he articulate to her, as clearly as he does to his readers in his introduction, his intention to, quote, visit those Americans who have fled from the North and the South into Upper Canada? Did he assure her that she had, as he writes, quote, the sympathies of many friends in the United States, end quote? Did he advise her in the same tone, which reads in his introduction as condescending and patronizing, that her, quote, good conduct and success in life may have an important bearing on the destinies of millions of your brethren who have the misfortune to be descended from slave mothers, end quote. I cannot help hearing misfortune as Drew condemning Sophia's mother, Dinah, and her ancestral mothers, rather than looking into himself and seeing that her real misfortune was to descend in another sense within a system of chattel slavery from which he cannot self-righteously distance himself. So that's from the opening chapter. I just have to remember where I'm at. So a little bit of backstory. So Sophia Bertham was born in Fishkill, New York, which is in Dutchess County, which is just on the Hudson River, just north of what is now New York City. It was largely a Dutch community. The Dutch had settled the area prior to the British. She's born there. She's born to enslaved parents. And then what happens in the interview, she tells the story that she was stolen, that her and her sister were stolen when they were playing among the currant bushes. And she said she was about 7 years old, by the sons-in-law. And then she names two men, Daniel Atwater and another gentleman. Daniel Atwater is the key figure. Then she says that she's taken to a boat down at the landing on the Hudson, put in the hold, blindfolded. She doesn't know how long the journey was. Arrives in Albany, New York, and then they went by land. They crossed the Mohawk Valley across upstate New York, eventually arriving in Niagara, where she is sold to Tyndale Joseph Brant, who, so on the screen right now on the left is one of many paintings of Brant. He often appears very different in the paintings, partly because they were often painted after he died by artists who never knew him. This is by William Birksey. It's a small painting, and he's standing in a kind of invented landscape, probably a hybrid of the Grand River and the Mohawk River. On the right, there is a painting by Shelley Nero, who's Mohawk, Turtle Clan Mohawk, one of the folks that read my book before it was published, great artist, Scotiabank Award winner, Governor General's. There is no known image of Sophia, and a number of the folks who read the book in advance, I would often ask them to share back with me what struck them in the interview. And so for Shelley, she really thought a lot about what it would have been like for Sophia to live with Brant among the Mohawk. Ad Mohawk is what she called it, which is now Six Nations in the Brantford area. So this painting, which I commissioned for the book, is an imagined portrait of Sophia as she would have lived in the Brant household. And she lived with Brant for over 20 years, both at Mohawk and then eventually at Burlington when Brant moved to Burlington. Brant owned several other enslaved people. Often in histories, it's stated that he owned like 20, 30, which in the book I talk about is highly unlikely. Sophia in the interview talks about Brant, speaks about him in a way that suggests that for a period, she certainly thought she was adopted and part of the family. But she also acknowledges that at Mohawk, she knew of only one other enslaved person there. And there would have been many people of African diaspora who lived in the community as members of the community, as there still are. So that's the picture there. So she is owned by Joseph Brant. I write a lot in the book about him and who he is, and understanding him as a very colonized individual, somebody who was very British in his identity. He was a Mason, he was an Anglican. He was very close to the British. He certainly aspired to, and you can see that in the house that he built in Burlington, for a kind of status that was modeled on British gentry. And the owning of enslaved people was part of that in Upper Canada and New York, where he came from. So lots of people I've found when I talk about Sophia and the work will be like, well, Indigenous people owned slaves too, or they'll say Joseph Brant. They always point to Joseph Brant, and then they quote these unsupported statements that Brant owned 50 people or 40 people, which is not true. And then extend from that this idea that, oh, everybody. So I make it really clear. I write a lot in the book about the history of the British Empire and the model of chattel slavery as a system and how it is very specific to European colonization, that models of capturing prisoners in war, notions of quote, slavery within many indigenous and many cultures isn't chattel slavery. It is not reducing somebody to property. It isn't race-based, right? So I try to understand the complexity of who Brant was, a man trying to adapt to this colossal change in the world. But also to make the point that one Indigenous person doesn't become the evidence for all Indigenous people. So that's important. Brant, at the end of his life, died in 1807. Sophia in an interview says at that point she was sold for $100 to the Englishman at Ancaster, a man named Samuel Hatt, who was one of the founders with his brother of Dundas. And so I write a lot in the book about the Hatts and about Dundas. I can't talk about all that today. It isn't clear 100% if Brant himself sold her or whether it was his widow and son after, but the point is she was sold. And that would have been a huge, I think, shock and devastating thing for Sophia, because she clearly believed that she had been adopted into the family, as so many people were, right? So she lives for less than a decade with the Hatts. The Hatts came from England, very wealthy, very connected family who came into the region, were given land. Basically, Richard Hatt comes first. He's the one who is most respected and honored in Dundas history. And then his father and his two brothers and sister and 8 indentured servants come. Each of the sons gets land. They are given more land free from the crown for all sorts of things, to build a mill, to have a warehouse on the beach, to all sorts of things. They had money, they had land in Scarborough, they had land in the Hamilton area, Glanford and so on. I've done a lot of work around Sophia and the town of Dundas and gotten a lot of pushback from Dundas, because people are like, she never, Samuel Hatt never lived here. He lived in Ancaster. He never lived in Dundas, right? Well, to be clear, at the time that Sophia and Hatt lived here, there was no Dundas. There was an area which half of Dundas is part of, known as Ancaster Township. It still is called Ancaster Township. So when she refers to Samuel Hatt, the Englishman of Ancaster, she's referring to that area. The Hatts owned and developed mills in Dundas along the Spencer Creek. That's what they're famous for in the region. Samuel Hatt also gets kind of written out of the history of the town. Lots of people will tell you he never lived there. He left earlier than he did. This was a man who was actually quite a major presence in the town. He was Justice of the Peace. He was in the militia. He owned property and business. He left the region after the War of 1812, and that's the time that Sophia would have taken her freedom and just left. Nobody gave her freedom. As a result, he just kind of like fades while the history of Dundas is being written in this great celebration of the heroic Richard Hatt. Some of you will be familiar, I'm sure, with the problematic naming of the town Dundas. Henry Dundas was Lord Melville, was a lawyer and MP from Edinburgh, Scotland, and single-handedly pretty much blocked the abolition of slavery in the British Empire in Parliament for more than 2 decades. So he's not like somebody you want to like proudly name your town for, but the town really defends Dundas forever. So when people in Dundas say to me, Dundas forever, I just think, yes, you want to embrace this racist history forever, go for it. But that's what you're doing. That's who Dundas is, okay? So, and I'm sure lots of folks know that. So I'm just watching my time. So obviously I can't tell you the whole story of Sophia. That's why I wrote a book, but those are some of the details. Stolen, the past erased. The only known record of her, besides her appearing in a census in 1851 in Peel Township, when she's living in the Queensbush, which was an pretty much all black settlement that was established in the early 19th century. At one point, more than 1,000 people lived in that area. When the Canada Company comes in the 1830s and starts carving up what was known as the Huron Tract and the Queensbush, and for settlers, they basically tell the people settled there that they have to buy their land that they've already cleared and developed, just like any other settler into the region who, if you improve the land, were basically granted title, except for the Black community there and in many other parts of the province. So the community disperses. Many of the people go back to the United States at the end of the Civil War. People move into Guelph, Toronto, Hamilton. So Sophia, it's not clear where she ended up, but I have a sense that she probably stayed there because the census tells me that she was living in a home with a family that remained, one of the few families who were able to remain on the land. So that's why I believe she's actually buried there. But the interview with Drew is the only known first person account of someone enslaved in Canada, which makes it really shocking that it existed in this book for so long, this anomaly that Drew didn't realize like what he had, like what was in the book. So the initial impulse for me, I came across Sophia's story when the book was republished in the 90s by Dundurn Press. And it didn't really strike me at first when I read. I was interested in her story because she had lived in an area where I grew up and lived and our landscapes overlap. But I really didn't strike me how significant it was until about a decade ago. And the realization that, that she was enslaved in Canada, I knew that, but that that hadn't been acknowledged by Drew themselves. Like the Drew in his brief forward and things doesn't seem to realize that she does not fit the model of what he's writing about these people that heroically escaped from the United States and came here. So that's really important. So part of my impulse to pursue this was my work has been for decades built around an interest in those who are not talked about, those who get erased, and the creation of these stories and myths, the myth of Canada, the myth of, this great nation of not the United States. There was no slavery. We don't have racism. We're multicultural. And a lot of that is just crap and myth making. So I often look for the stories of people and communities that have been left out of that narrative. And through either exhibitions or art or writing, I try to address that. And that's how I initially came to wanting to write about Sophia, and by writing about and to Sophia, I write to her to talk about these bigger issues, to position something very specific and local in a much bigger global context. So I write about empire, write about the history of the planet. I write about a whole range of things to position her into a bigger story, always aware that I don't have her permission, that I am like Drew, engaging and attempting to tell a story that I think is important. But I'm also really conscious that by initiating this conversation, this dialogue, this writing, I'm building a network and connecting to a whole community of people who I think it hopefully will be beneficial to, and who will also challenge me, critique, call me out as I continue on the journey, because it's not a one-off. I'm a firm believer that once you engage with a person, a presence, they don't leave you. They become connected, right? And that you have a responsibility to carry that weight, right? Of the conversation, of the dialogue, of the exchange that happens. My life is shaped very much now by this constant engagement with Sophia's presence. Sophia is still very much present in this place, in this landscape. And I think a lot about that, and that relates to other folks as well. I'm happy to talk about that more later. I mentioned about Dundas. I just sort of share this shot of, I did a legal intervention in Dundas about a year and a half ago. I was really annoyed. I have been for a while about this sort of obsessive Dundas forever, we're so great. But also there's on the sign there, you see on the left of where you enter Dundas, it had this, they added, I don't remember, a discussion about doing this public signage, home of the Allen Cup champions, so some local amateur hockey team. And that's what you're told when you arrive in Dundas. That is the thing the town wants you to know, right? Is that an amateur hockey team is from there. And they won a cup that isn't really that relevant anymore. I won't go off into that. So I started to add signs around town that said Sophia Berthen lived here and told the story enslaved in this home. They would get vandalized, torn down, painted over. I did about 100 of them. And then the city of Hamilton fined me like 11 times. So I share it publicly. I owe the city of Hamilton apparently over $3,000 in fines for putting up the sign, which I'm not going to pay because it's like they've never convincingly, in response to my appeals, told me why they chose to fine me when they were not during COVID enforcing this law about putting up signs on public property. And they've never answered that. And it was also like arbitrary. Like I put up more than 13 signs, so why didn't they fine me for 100, right? And they never dealt with the expressions of hate and racism in the altering of the signs. So I just wanted to share that. So Engaging with Sophia and the History is a book. It's also about challenging the stories that are told in the public space. So I'm going to, I hope it's okay, somebody wave if this isn't, but I'm going to read another part of the book. And if I can remember where I am. And that is, it's from the chapter which is called Ley Lines. And this is chapter 5, and it's page 53. Chapter 5, Ley Lines at Fishkill. And this is a few pages. And what I'm showing you on the screen right now, and then I'm going to pop ahead. This is the original Thomas Rideau's diagram of the Alderman Tract. For those of you who, I'm sure folks are familiar, those of you not, at the end of the American Revolution, the communities, people who were of the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, who had fought with the British, were kicked, basically had nowhere to live anymore at the American Revolution. This is very simplified. They were granted the land all along the Grand River, 6 miles back roughly from each shore. It was acquired from the Mississauga by the British Crown and then granted. It's known as the Haldimand Tract. It has always been contested. You can kind of see on the map, there's like a line through the middle, and that distinguishes the lower from the upper block. And for a long time, those of you who know the region, around Brantford is where the Six Nations community is. At Brant's time, Sophia would have come into Canada in 1785 with Joseph Brant and the communities that settled along the Grand, reestablished what would have been referred to as the Longhouse. I'm grateful to Susan Hill and her remarkable book, The Clay We Are Made Of, for really understanding from an Indigenous perspective the whole history of this land and this landscape and its relationship to the Longhouse that was destroyed in the Mohawk Valley. So it echoes, like if you look at it originally, the towns, the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Seneca, all along there, the communities are established. So when Sophia said she lived at Mohawk, she's referring to the community of the Mohawk at the upper end. The upper part of the block, which becomes Kitchener, Waterloo, and up into there, that was always contested. The British and settler people claimed, oh, no, that was never intended. And of course, the Six Nations always said, no, that is our land. And I write in the book about all these settlers who come later into Hamilton and the Dundas who benefited hugely from financially from being given that land. Okay, so but landscapes are really important to me and to this story because I write about land and landscape. I go places. I believe I can read in the landscape. It's like an archive, a trace living archive. Something I learned from Jeff Thomas, who I mentioned earlier. Jeff and I both have traveled this landscape quite a bit, and much of Sophia's landscape is a lived landscape for me. The places that she lived and journeyed to are places that I have lived and worked. So on the blow up on the right, you can see the Grand River on the left, the blue. You can see that brown line that kind of cuts through, and it says Ancaster, Beverly. That's the eastern edge of the Haldeman Tract. So Ancaster Township and Dundas, Barton. So I'm sitting right now talking to you from Barton, right, which is now Hamilton. So this landscape is my landscape, right? The landscape I live in. So this is a picture of a map that dates from 1778, Thomas Kitchen Sr.'s map, the southern part of the province of New York with part of the adjoining colonies. So it's a little hard, I can't point, or maybe, oh, I can point. So you see here, there's Nassau, Long Island, Manhattan, Staten Island. This is the Hudson River going up into the highlands. And you can see in here, Peaks Kill, and Fishkill is in this area over here. And so she would have been born in this area, brought to the river, and then taken upriver. And then Albany is up here, and then they would have gone by land. You can see Pennsylvania over there, New Jersey. This map comes from the collection in Albany, New York, the Albany Historical Society. So I'm going to read ley lines. And I read a bit of a definition before about what ley lines are. This is a quote from Michael Groth, Slavery and Freedom in the Mid-Hudson Valley. Bondage in Dutchess County could be brutal and violent, and household slavery in the countryside could be extraordinarily oppressive. Scars and disabilities attested not only to the harsh reality of life and labor in the 18th century Hudson Valley. Sorry, my cat is trying to join the reading, and he's now leaving. Sorry about that. Now I have to find my page again. Sorry. Bondage in Dutchess County could be brutal and violent, and household slavery in the countryside could be extraordinarily oppressive. Scars and disabilities attested not only to the harsh reality of life and labor in the 18th century Hudson Valley, but also to the violence of an institution that grew more brutal over time. Kill and hook. The terms sound brutal, as if they are naming acts of violence or pointing to the finality of the grave. But these terms, which echo across the former New Netherlands, around what is now New York State and along the Hudson River, are Dutch. Kill means creek, stream, river, or inlet. A hook is a spit or a point of land. Fishkill, originally Viskill, Catskill, sometimes Catskill, Peekskill, Freshkills, Kill Van Kull, and Bronxkill equal Fish Creek, Cats Creek, Peaks Creek, Fresh Creek's Creek of Kull, and Bronx Creek. Bronx comes from Dutchman Jonas Bronk, who settled the area in the 1600s. Sandy Hook, Red Hook, and Kinderhook combine English and Dutch words. In English, these names would be Sandy Point, Red Point, and Child Point. Acknowledging their roots, these names still speak to me of violence. They project a bleakness, perhaps because so often places near the water's edge become sites of industrial filth, home to the destitute and the working poor. In many places, like Hamilton, where I grew up, such places were buried in landfill in order to build factories and piers, rail yards, and railroads along the harbor, once defined by numerous inlets and abundant wildlife. These rivers and streams continued to flow underground to eventually resurface to flood streets and basements and to collapse roadways. These kills destabilize the foundations of the present. It is hard to permanently bury the past. The village of Fishkill in Dutchess County, New York was defined by land, not water. It grew like adjacent communities because of the rich soils for farming in the valleys, surrounded by some of the oldest mountains on earth. It has views of the Hudson Highlands and to the distant Catskill Mountains across a wide Hudson River, which Sophia called North River, just 12 miles away. The Highlands were named for Henry Hudson, another English mariner on a colonial quest. Fishkill Creek, and I should just add, for having forgotten the meaning of kill, the English unwittingly repeat the word. So basically it's called Fish Creek Creek, Fishkill Creek, Fish Creek Creek, empties into the Hudson south of Dennings Point. From the landing at Beacon, just north of there, boats would ship and receive chattel, heading up, down, and across the water, over to Kingston, south to New York City, and north to Albany, once called Fort Orange. In its meanderings from east to west, flowing out of the Fishkill Mountains, Fishkill Creek carries the waters of the Sweezy, Christine, McKinney, and Furnace Ponds, Frog Hollow Brook, and Sylvan Lake, as well as Sprout, Wikipe, and Clove Creeks, among other smaller rivulets and streams. Fishkill is in the heart of Dutchess County, just south of Poughkeepsie, roughly an hour north of Manhattan by today's roads. Its current population is just over 2,100. It occupies the lands of the Wappinger people, who were largely driven from their lands, first by Dutch forces allied with the Haudenosaunee, and later by a flood of British settlers. The last Wappinger sachem, Daniel Nimham, or Ninham, traveled to England in 1766 to plead for the return of their traditional lands. The Royal Lords of Trade heard this plea and declared that, quote, the conduct of the Lieutenant Governor and the Council of New York does carry with it the color of great prejudice and partiality of an intention to intimidate these Indians, end quote. Yet the Lords of Trade did nothing. A later decision by the New York provincial governor, Sir Henry Moore, decided, quote, that returning the land to the Indians would set an adverse precedent, end of quote. By the end of the 18th century, the Wappinger people were dispersed, absorbed into other nations, including their old enemies, the Haudenosaunee. Were Sophia's parents born at Fishkill, or brought there via what she called North River? Were they even born in New York State? Slaveholders in the mid-Hudson Valley often bought in the markets at New York City or at Albany or Poughkeepsie, where many of the newly arrived people from the Caribbean and West Africa were auctioned. Quote, colonial New York contained the largest enslaved population. It grew by 70% between 1750 and 1770, end quote. That's Margaret Washington explaining in Sojourner Truth's America. Quote, by then, merchants imported captives directly from Africa, end quote. In Dutchess County, slaves were constantly being sold or hired out for extended periods by one neighbor to another or passed on within a family from generation to generation. Sophia's ancestors may have been in the area for decades. She says she was 7 when her abductors, quote, came into the garden. How much could she have known of her ancestry? How well did she know her parents? At least she told us their names. When she recalls, quote, my sister and I were playing among the currant bushes. Where were Dinah and Oliver at that moment that preceded the tragedy of their children being kidnapped? No doubt they were preoccupied laboring for their masters. I can only imagine the loss of their daughters to have been devastating. The details suggest that the sale of the girls needed to be hidden and that there was another further shady layer on top of the reprehensible base act of selling human beings. Why have I come to this conclusion? Because slavery was ubiquitous in Dutchess County. The regular sale of enslaved individuals was a constant practice in a community where the white practice of owning 1 to 3 Black people was the norm, even among those of limited means. It is a myth that only rich people owned enslaved people. With the exception of elite, wealthy families who enslaved many, most only, quote, required or could afford a few, which meant enslaved families were regularly broken up. As high as 75% of enslaved parents spouses, and children lived separated and with minimal contact. Quote, throughout the colonial period, and this is Michael E. Grove, the slave family enjoyed no legal protection. Not until 1809 did state law recognize enslaved families. The threat of sale was particularly salient in the Hudson Valley, end quote. Breaking up families generated revenue for owners, prefiguring the all too common practice of destroying families and selling the enslaved from northern states to southern plantations, which emerged as the 19th century progressed. This is really important to remember, as a little aside, is when people talk about abolition in the North and how, Northerners were against slavery, they never had slavery. When slavery was abolished in northern states, many people simply sold enslaved people into southern plantations. When Quakers, there are lots of people talk about Quakers in the Northeast, these great abolitionists, when they made a decision that to be a Quaker, you could not own enslaved people, rather than freeing their enslaved people, most Quakers sold them. So they were no longer like, oh, I don't feel bad, I don't own an enslaved person, but they certainly didn't give up the benefit of financial. And also, I won't get into here, but many folks listening will know that with the abolition of slavery, both in the United States and in the British Empire, there was compensation to those who lost property. So British people were given money for all the enslaved people that they lost because of abolition, or property that they lost, but the enslaved people were given nothing. And this is true in the United States as well. So important. The demand for slave labor from northern states had dramatically increased following the passing of the Act prohibiting importation of slaves in 1807 and the adoption of Eli Whitney's cotton gin, or cotton engine, which mechanized the separation of cotton fiber and seed on southern plantations. One of the most misguided ideas about slavery is that for those held in bondage, where numbers were relatively low, that is, in the northern states, colonies, and in what became Canada, the experience of enslavement was somehow more humane. A related concept is that, quote, domestic slaves who worked in the home were, quote, privileged. Scholar Christy Clark Pujara destroys that myth. Quote, domestic labor is labor, not status. Laboring the home was essential to survival, end quote. Even those who acknowledged the harshness of conditions often suggested that bonds were formed in the close-knit settings where masters and the enslaved lived under the same roof. Helen Wilkinson Reynolds, author of Dutch Houses in the Hudson Valley before 1776, states that the enslaved, quote, were quartered in the cellars and attics of the master's dwellings or in outbuildings nearby and received practically no consideration in connection with provisions for light and air, end quote, only to undermine any sense of empathy by stating, quote, but the personal relationships between the two races were kindly and allowing for an occasional owner of irascible disposition and an occasional Black of incorrigible tendencies, goodwill prevailed and often deep attachments, end quote. The loyalty and deference to masters, evidence shows the opposite. Such bonding was extremely rare and occasional. The loyalty and deference to masters arose mainly in what Margaret Washington described as, quote, a form of defense, end quote. Such defenses thinned when confronted by the brutality of slavery in a region that remained pro-slavery beyond the Revolution and discouraged manumission well into the 19th century. If you're not familiar, manumission is the legal process of freeing a person. So, right, or freeing an enslaved person. Well into the 19th. Sojourner Truth's heavily scarred back gave her cause to hate white slaveholders in the Hudson Valley. Drew would witness Sophia's numerous scars and cicatrices of wounds, quote, as he confirms in a note in her interview, and one can imagine others he would not have seen or recognized, marks that were both physical and psychological. One of the things he really draws attention to is the significant scars she has. She has quite pronounced scars on her head, which is from a hatchet wound and knife wounds. So any comments on that? And then also suggests that she may have also received those from unnamed white people. Here are some other hard numbers from government records. In the second half of the 18th century, the number of Black people in Dutchess County was the highest in the whole colony of New York, growing by nearly 300%, reaching a population of 2,300, of which 1,856 were enslaved. The first federal census of the United States in 1790 reveals that 75% of enslaved people lived in Clinton, Fishkill, Poughkeepsie, and Rhinebeck. Fishkill was home to almost 1/3 of all the known enslaved in Dutchess County. 10% of residents of Fishkill were enslaved. 20% of Fishkill households held enslaved people. There was clearly a well-established slave trade in the Fishkill area. Had they not been stolen, the Burton sisters would not need to be silenced, taken discreetly to the landing, hidden below deck, and snuck upriver for a long journey west through dangerous and hostile territory, to then be sold to an infamous ally of the British living at Niagara at the peak of the revolutionary tensions, and when Fishkill was at the heart of patriot country, sounds deeply suspicious. It is not Sophia's recollections I find suspicion, it is the actions of her captors. So I'm just going to read one more thing. I write to Sophia. There was a conscious decision to write to her in the process of writing. And I can talk later if anybody's interested about why I chose to do that. Dear Sophia, there is more unpacking to do to clarify this moment in your life and to attempt to settle the foundations of your story. Too many things just don't allow for this to have happened long before the American Revolution, which is what she says in the interview, as Drew claims you stated. Perhaps he misunderstood and blurred events of the War of Independence and the War of 1812, the latter war being the continuation of the unfinished former conflict, pitting the same old adversaries against each other to settle all that was left unresolved during your childhood. On top of your enslavement, you are trapped in these uncertainties, these decades of conflict and intrigue, when nothing was stable or predictable, which makes understanding Drew's transcription of your truths complicated today. I deal a lot in the book with one of the issues around Sophia's original interview with Drew is that up until, one of the reasons I started doing the research to do this book project was because the few times that Sophia would surface in people's conversations, it was one to like point away from any kind of accountability of settler people or people of British descent for slavery and say like, oh, Indigenous people, and they would point to Brant, so you would hear her name. And then the other had to do with the point I was just making there in that letter to her. And that was, you know, people would try to piece together based on the interview, this timeline. And if you read it, it's quite messed up. The numbers, the dates, they don't add up. It doesn't make any sense. It's not, I don't think it's totally her. I think it's in the race to record all these interviews that Drew did, that things get mixed up. So you get things like, I was 7 years old, I was stolen, I was taken to Brant, I lived with Brant, you know, for 7 years, then I was 13, then I was sold to this and like all the numbers get garbled. So early on in the process of writing the book is like I had these crazy like timelines on the wall behind me where I try to piece it all together. And certainly one of the important thing is her talking about, you know, I'm 7 years old, I'm stolen and I'm taken to Niagara, I'm sold to Brant, and then I come into Canada. So a lot of people based on that would say like, oh, she arrived in Canada before anybody else. She was here in the 1770s, right? Because she says she's 90, so she was born at this time, 7 years old, right? Not possible. Joseph Brant does not come into Canada to settle with his family until 1785, after the American Revolution, when Mohawk is settled, when the Haudenosaunee come into the country. He would have been in the country previously, but not with his third wife, who is Sophia's mistress. So it was like take a lot of going through and reading in between the lines to come to that. But once that work is done, things open up, things start to make sense. One can understand more deeply these wider connections. So I had started off in the beginning. I'm sorry I've gone on a bit long, but this is really important to me. So I'm just going to say this quickly. I won't read as much, but there are a number of writers that have been had a huge impact on my thinking as somebody who didn't read a lot when they were a kid and then started to read and started writing. And even before taking this project on, I've always been shaped by the thinking of James Baldwin. And so I wanted to share this. This quote comes from this amazing book that Eddie Glow Jr. published last year called Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own. And it's for two reasons, just to emphasize why Baldwin is so important to me. One is this concept of begin again, which is something we all have to do constantly. And the second is in the process of writing the book, and then when the book came out last year, this is the first anniversary today of its publishing, I got a lot of pushback. People would say, you shouldn't be writing. So I would get like, you're a white cis man, and which isn't, I'm a queer person of whiteness. And, but they were like, you shouldn't write Black history. It's wrong. You shouldn't be quoting Black writers. And so I accept that as valid. But my response was, as Dr. Chrmaine Nelson said to me once, the history of slavery is not Black history. It's all of our history. And we need to take accountability and responsibility, those of us of a settler background and people of whiteness. But also what I'm writing is a bigger narrative. It is Sophia's story. It involves Black history in this place, but it's also about the British Empire, and it's global, and it's the planet, and it's a worlding. It's about me. It's about how do you write a story? How do we write history? It's all those things. The other part, in particular around somebody like Baldwin, is my thinking is shaped by Baldwin since I was a young person and reading Baldwin's work. And what people have to, I think, realize and remember is that much of what Baldwin wrote and a lot of what he said publicly was a challenge to whiteness, was a calling out of whiteness, was speaking to me. So what I see myself doing is responding to his call out. And I take that really seriously. So I feel like he's often speaking to me. So this, to all of us, to anyone, sorry, I just jumped ahead. So this quote, which I'm having trouble seeing because of my screen, is really important, and I quoted in the book. So the quote, I'll read the part, begin again is shorthand for something Baldwin commended to the country in the latter part of his career. He's speaking to all of the United States, and particularly to people of whiteness, that we re-examine the fundamental values and commitments that shape our self-understanding, and that we look back to those beginnings, not to reaffirm our greatness or to double down on myths that secure our innocence, but to see where we went wrong and how we might reimagine or recreate ourselves in light of who we originally set out to be. This requires an unflinching encounter with the lie at the heart of our history. That's really important. So the last thing I'll just share, I had thanked a number of people. Reagan Greenidge, who you see on the screen holding the book. The book is dedicated to Reagan. Amazing person I met when they were a student at Western. They traveled with me on this journey. We talked extensively about understanding Sophia and what Reagan thought Sophia might be saying in certain parts. And you can read about that in the book. Remarkable person, deeply committed to Indigenous language restoration. That's the work they do now. But I just want to close my comments with, again, just a heartfelt shout out to Reagan. Thank you so much. Hello. I talked a lot longer and read things. So I'm happy. I know there's not much time left. I'm sharing my email, Instagram, Facebook, stuff, people should feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to answer any comments or questions. I'm not quite sure how that's working. Maybe somebody can, there was a message to please start to round up like ages ago, which I did not see because I did not have that turned on because
Okay.
I am ridiculously, I was distracted by a cat. I'm so sorry.
No, it's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for this amazing talk today.
Yeah, there's questions I'm happy to answer. I know I ran long.
Thank you for letting us into the life of Sophia. Thank you.
Yeah.
We're just gonna have a few. I know that our time is far spent, but if
Yeah.
anyone has any questions or comments, please raise your hand. If you're in person, you can raise your hand and we can call you, or electronically raise your hand, please. Thank you.
Yeah. So there's a Destiny.
Question, yes.
Yeah, I had a question. Hi, Destiny.
Says,
Yeah, go ahead.
Destiny says, thank you for your talk. I was just curious, what made you decide to speak directly to Sophia? Was it all inspired by methods of autoethnography?
That's a really good question. It's something I've done for a long time in my writing as a writer. There's a point, I think it's a reflection of a desire to like, oh God, I wish I was able to speak to this person. And if I could speak to them, what would I say? What questions would I ask? And initially, I think it comes out of that impulse to just honor a person by engaging and to ask permission. I really wish I could ask somebody like Sophia the permission to speak and think and imagine who they are. And so it comes from that. It also comes out of, I was talking about James Baldwin, the letter he writes to his nephew, this amazing essay he writes where he's writing to a future, like a child that's just been born and writing into the future about being born as a Black man in the United States. So I find, like I said at the beginning, there's a story I think is important to tell. I want to write well so that people will read it and it'll stick, because I know, like, I'll read just about a book about just about anything if it's well written and thoughtful. And so, and in writing, I draw on a lot of different forms to carry a narrative. I'm not an academic historian. I'm not interested in being an academic. I intentionally pursued and undertook this book independently with a publisher. I didn't go into academia to do it. I wanted it to get out into the world and be read by wider community, which isn't criticizing academia. I work lots with academics, but I am not one, so I want to speak out. And so I try to write well, and I find that it is a tool that the writing to has been something that a lot of people have responded to in previous projects. And so it's actually one of the things that has been most positively commented on is doing that, is writing to Sophia. And it's also like genuine. It's not like, I do believe that Sophia is a presence, that she exists within the place and the landscape that I move through. So I write and I speak, like, in the same sense that I speak to my grandfather regularly and my father regularly, even though they passed. So that's important to me. But I think one of the strategies of writing and changing, writing something that's more poetry or moving into an academic approach or writing a letter is you write differently. And therefore, I think you think a bit differently. You think about, like, well, if I wasn't writing an academic paper about this person or this event, how would I think about it if I was writing to them a personal message, a card? And I think that makes me like see this person as human, right? Like Sophia lived her life as a statistic, as chattel, much of it. I want to engage them as a person, not just, I'll share numbers and facts to support the discussion. but it's important over and over in the book for people to remember she's a human being, right? A human being who led a very long, complicated life, and we sadly know very little about. And as difficult that is to say about Sophia, at least we know Sophia. We know this trace of this person. So many of the people that lived enslaved here, we know nothing about. And the fact that Canadians don't teach or are not willing to engage with it just drives it further home, the tragedy and the ignorance in this country, right? And I see a lot of parallels to like how many Canadians have responded to Truth and Reconciliation or the discovery of graves at residential schools. It's like people are just so fast to want to move on from it or not acknowledge it. It's echoed in institutions. I'm very critical of public institutions and museums because the same people who have been curators and directors for decades are still there, but now apparently are all woke and doing this, the good work, but you are the ones in the institutions not doing the work. So get out of the way. So anyways, I went off. I tend to go off on side brain things, but writing to Sophia is really important because she's a person and I want to be in a conversation dialogue with people, and I include her in that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Ange. So there are two. So I see Susan's hand up, but before we go to Susan, there's a question that was asked from Gillian. Thank you. Where is your book available? And then we can.
Hi, and I'm waving. Hi, Gillian, down there. Hi. Yeah, it's available all over the place. It sounds like an ad, right? In fine bookstores. Most independent bookshops, you can order it directly from Goose Lane. You can order it online. Please don't order it from Amazon. But you can order it. It's not hard to get. I'm grateful to the response and the support of independent bookshops. And Chapters Indigo has been really good. They featured it. And also academics and for sharing it and so on. So it's not hard to get, but Goose Lane, again, I really appreciate. And their website is connected through my website. So yeah.
All right, thank you. Can we final person for today?
Yeah.
I have to apologize. I know that.
Oh, that's okay.
That's okay.
Thank you all for staying.
You sort of answered my question anyway about the reason there is such a lack of documents is that I'm hearing you say it was in part because they were simply chattel and therefore lacked personhood.
Yeah.
Even when, is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, so
about?
I guess there's a couple of layers to it. One is, what do archives say? Who runs archives? Historically, archives, are the people that are in charge. They're within like colonial institutions, the museum, the library. So the kinds of things that are recorded and how they're recorded is a reflection of the powers that are running those systems. So there's that. But yeah, one of the primary reasons is that both enslaved people did not exist as persons, so they don't show up within the time that they're enslaved as property, they show up as property if you can find them. They don't show up in the sentences. They don't show up named. Often their names change over time. It's very hard to trace people because somebody would be sold and then the new, master decides your name's, Caesar instead of Thor or whatever. That was very common. It was very common to hide your property for tax reasons, and particularly among the UELs, the United Emperor Loyalists that came out of the United States of the Indian American Revolution endeavor into this region. Many of them brought enslaved people. They were encouraged to bring enslaved people with them. It was part of the benefit, like you won't lose this property. So many people bring enslaved people, but they don't list them as that. They'll say they brought their servants, or if they include them. Where you find people, sadly, are in things like wills, where property appears. But it's sad because you'll see in a will, I'm going to leave my barn, my 2 horses, my hog, my dinnerware, and my Negro wench to my sister or something. So you have to know where to look and how to look. And you also can't, like a lot of the pushback and that we get from conservative academics and local history types is, they will use the absence as a weapon against, and they will not acknowledge that the model of history that has been practiced in academia and public history and local history and archives is racist. They won't acknowledge that, right? And so they'll be like, well, show me the documents, show me the records that these 1,100 people lived in the Queen's Bush. And it's, you know, you can't, because I don't see them in the census. It's because they don't exist in the census. They don't exist, or things like that. They don't exist where in the documents you value, in the institutions that you value, right? So that's a big part of it. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank
Thanks.
you all so much. Thank you, first of all, Andrew, for
Oh, a pleasure.
such an amazing time. We really appreciate you coming to give us this talk at the Tubman Institute. Thank you, everyone who
Yeah.
showed up virtually, in person. Thank you all so much. And one more thing. So the Tubman Institute is working on starting its very own journal. Yay! And so what that means that it'll be great when you're writing and for journals, writing journal entries, please think of us as a great place to send your article for a peer-reviewed journal. Thank you all so much. And I hope you have a wonderful evening.
Okay, thank you, Saleva. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Great work. Keep it up.
Thank you.
Is he still on?
Still here. Hi. I apologize. I do go on, and I also, because I have autism and neurodivergent, like I have very little sense of time sometimes, so I have to immerse myself. I also, you could probably tell, I was occasionally keeping my dog away. At one point, if I was jerking, my old cat was clawing my back, which Max has experienced, these talons going into my spine. So anyways, Gertrude, hi.
Hi.
Yeah.
So very good talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
I wonder, Rebecca, do we have a possibility to have hybrid from the resource center?
Yeah, I just messaged you about your message.
Yeah.
We tried to do it today. It's really just off my laptop. So
Oh,
my screen is a little small, so it's hard to see. But if we could get like the projector up on the wall, then it would be a bigger screen, so it could be more hybrid.
yeah.
So it's a possibility,
Okay.
but we need the proper screen. We just did, there are just a couple of us, so we just decided to do like an impromptu like screening party, and it was great.
Wow, wow. Yeah, thank you. So
I
we
also-
do not have a projector yet?
No, we don't, unfortunately.
I have one. I would happily give it to you to do that.
Oh,
If you need a projector, I have one. Yeah, I'll bring it up to York. I'd like to bring a couple copies of the book for the Institute as well.
oh,
Thank
Those
you.
two.
thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah.
We'll add it to our resource library. You can have a
Yeah.
little virtual tour here. This is our resource
Yeah.
library.
Yeah, one day maybe I can actually visit in person would be nice.
Yeah.
Because I thought I was. I'm that,
Wow.
like, I get a little out of it and then I don't even realize, even though the poster says virtual, that it's virtual. Like I'm making plans to drive up today.
Oh,
And I was like, oh, right.
Wow.
Yeah, that's what
Wow.
virtual means.
so well.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
it means a lot. The work just keeps, like for me, the work improves because of these conversations and
Yeah.
the feedback and the people I meet. It means a lot. Yeah, it certainly means a lot to have the opportunity to speak with the community around the Tubman Institute. Just to get to
Thank
say her name means so much. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I'm really thrilled, like as you know, like I